With the Iran war dominating headlines today, many Americans are arguing about intervention, empire, and patriotism. But this debate is not new. In 1898, the United States fought the Spanish-American War, and critics like Mark Twain and Jane Addams warned that wars of choice could threaten democracy at home. Imagine opening the news and reading headlines like these. America must intervene overseas to defend freedom. Our military power can reshape another nation. Opposing the war is dangerous and unpatriotic. Well, those headlines sound like they belong to our world today, but they actually come from 1898. In that year, the United States fought the Spanish-American War, a conflict that transformed the United States from a continental republic into a global power. And here's the surprising part. Some of the fiercest critics of that war were not radicals or outsiders. They were popular and respected Americans like the writer Mark Twain and the social reformer Jane Addams. They warned that an empire and military conquest could destroy the ideals the United States claimed to defend. And their debate about war, democracy, and patriotism sounds remarkably familiar today. In this video, we're going to explore why the United States went to war in 1898, how Americans fiercely debated that war at home, why Twain and Addams believed that opposing imperial war was the most patriotic position possible, and why their warnings still matter today. By the 1890s, the United States was experiencing explosive economic growth. Railroads connected the continent. Factories produced steel, machinery, and consumer goods on a massive scale. But this prosperity also produced intense inequality. Political cartoons of the era often showed enormous wealth concentrated in the hands of industrialists while workers struggled beneath them. This was the world that Twain famously labeled the Gilded Age, a society glittering with wealth but hiding deep political corruption and dangerous inequality beneath the surface. At the same time, powerful business and political leaders were beginning to argue that the United States needed overseas markets and strategic power. The Cuban Rebellion against Spanish imperial rule offered a perfect opportunity. American newspapers, especially those controlled by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, filled their pages with stories about Spanish brutality. Some were true. Others were exaggerated and sensationalized. Then came the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898. Although the cause of the explosion was unclear, newspapers quickly blamed Spain. The cry spread across the United States, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain!" War followed within weeks. The war itself was brief. First came naval victories in the Philippines. Then American ground forces invaded Cuba and quickly defeated Spain. But the consequences were enormous. The United States gained control of several overseas territories, a protectorate over Cuba, control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The Philippines, in particular, became the center of a fierce debate. Filipino revolutionaries had expected independence after Spain's defeat. Instead, the United States decided to rule the islands. This decision triggered the longer Philippine-American War. That conflict was brutal and prolonged. Thousands of American soldiers died. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos died in combat, famine, and disease. This conflict officially lasted from February 1899 to July of 1902, but skirmishes with Filipino guerrilla fighters continued till 1913. In 1898, the United States suddenly faced a question it had rarely confronted before. Could a nation founded on liberty rule another people without their consent? Many Americans answered that question with a clear no. In 1898, they formed the Anti-Imperialist League. Its members represented a remarkable coalition. Business leaders, intellectuals, social reformers, former abolitionists. Among them were two of the most powerful moral voices of the era, Mark Twain and Jane Addams. Twain used satire to attack imperialism. His essay, To the Person Sitting in Darkness, it uses biting satire to criticize American and European imperialism, especially U.S. actions in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. Twain marks the claim that Western powers were bringing civilization and Christianity to other nations, arguing that empire often meant violence, hypocrisy, and exploitation instead. The essay warns that imperialism betrayed the democratic ideals the United States claimed to represent. Jane Addams approached the issue from another perspective. Addams had spent her life working with immigrants and the urban poor at Hull House in Chicago. She believed democracy depended on cooperation, equality, and social reform. War, she argued, strengthened hierarchy, violence, and nationalism. Addams believed that empire abroad would inevitably damage democracy at home. For both Twain and Addams, opposing imperial war was not disloyal. It was an act of patriotism rooted in American ideals. They believed the Declaration of Independence had established a simple principle: no people should be governed without their consent. The Spanish-American War produced intense conflict within the United States, including little-known episodes that involved violent clashes between soldiers and civilians in several cities. Often these confrontations reflected the social tensions of the era. In Tampa, in 1898, where thousands of troops gathered before sailing to Cuba, tensions erupted around the camps of the legendary Buffalo Soldiers. Racial hostility, alcohol, and overcrowded military camps sparked riots in which white volunteer soldiers fired into black neighborhoods, destroyed property, and assaulted civilians. It was an ugly reminder that the war for freedom abroad unfolded amid deep injustice at home. Episodes like these remind us that when large numbers of armed men are mobilized quickly, especially volunteers or poorly trained forces, military bravado and a sense of wartime license can spill over into civilian life. Historians often point out that similar concerns arise in any situation where government authority is exercised by personnel who may be insufficiently trained or supervised, because usually discipline and accountability are essential safeguards in a democratic society. Another controversy centered on free speech. Members of the Anti-Imperialist League faced accusations of disloyalty. Public debates about patriotism and dissent filled newspapers and lecture halls. Jane Addams herself often faced criticism for speaking against militarism. But she insisted that democracy required citizens willing to openly question government policy. The war also intensified nativism and racism, especially toward people in newly acquired territories. Political cartoons of the time often depicted Filipinos, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans as childish or incapable of self-government. This is an attitude that still surfaces all too frequently today. For example, when displays of Puerto Rican identity like those by Bad Bunny in the Super Bowl 60 halftime show trigger angry reactions from critics who see such expressions as, ironically, un-American. These images reveal how empire was and is often justified through racial hierarchy. One of the best modern accounts of this 1898 debate appears in Stephen Kinzer's book, The True Flag. Kinzer argues that the Spanish-American War marked a turning point in American history. Before 1898, the United States had largely expanded across the continent. After 1898, the United States began acting as a global power. Kinzer also highlights something often forgotten. The United States nearly chose a different path. And these are the moments in history I'm particularly interested in. Now, as we mentioned before, the anti-imperialist movement included some of the most respected American voices of the era. They argued that empire would undermine democracy, encourage militarism, and entangle the nation in foreign conflicts. Their vision of patriotism was rooted not in expansion, but in fidelity to democratic principles. Kinzer calls this the struggle over the true flag, the question of what American ideals actually meant. For viewers interested in understanding this moment more deeply, Kinzer's book is one of the most accessible and powerful introductions to the debate. So why does this matter? Well, the debates of 1898 remind us of something important. Opposing war in American history has never been unusual, though it is often erased from history telling. From the Revolution of the 18th century to the Mexican War and Civil War of the 19th century, from the anti-imperialists of 1898 to critics of world wars, opponents of Vietnam, and opponents of 21st century Middle Eastern wars, Americans have long argued about the moral and political consequences of war. Figures like Mark Twain and Jane Addams remind us that dissent can be deeply patriotic. They believed loving one's country meant holding it accountable to its highest ideals. Their arguments still challenge us today. If history does not repeat, but it rhymes, well, then the debates of 1898 still have something to teach us. In fact, of course, the story doesn't end in 1898. When America entered World War I, Jane Addams did something almost unthinkable. She spoke out against the war. The reaction was fierce. Newspapers attacked her. Politicians denounced her. Many Americans called her unpatriotic. But Addams believed opposing war was the most patriotic thing a United States citizen could do. In our next video, we'll explore the extraordinary story of Jane Addams and the moment when speaking against war became dangerous in America. Until next time, safe journeys.